My name is Helen, and I never set out to leave a legacy. When you're a young wife standing in a bare front yard with a packet of seeds in your hand, you're not thinking about legacies. You're thinking about how much sun this corner gets, whether the soil is too hard to dig with the little trowel you brought from your apartment, and if you'll ever manage to make this place feel like home. Back then, our house looked like every other small house on the block, plain, a little tired, with patchy grass and a crooked mailbox that leaned just enough to make the mailman swear under his breath. We were newly moved in, newly married, and newly aware of how much work life could be when nobody else was footing the bill. It was a Tuesday in early spring, years ago now, when I first pressed a seed into that stubborn ground. My husband, George, had gone off to his shift at the plant, lunch pail swinging from his hand, shoulders squared the way men do when they're determined to provide, no matter how much their back already aches. The house was quiet in that way new houses are no echoes of children yet, no layers of memories in the walls. The sun was out, warm but not hot, and there was a chill in the breeze that still smelled faintly of winter. I stood on the front step with a cup of coffee and looked at the small rectangle of land between our house and the sidewalk. It wasn't much, just a strip of compacted soil, a few dandelions, a narrow path leading to the door. But as I stood there, I remembered my grandmother's yard back in the town where I grew up, how her front garden had been a riot of color, how people would slow their cars just to look at it, how she always had a jar of cut flowers on the kitchen table and dirt under her fingernails. "Flowers don't know if you're rich or poor," she used to say, wiping her hands on her apron. "They just know if someone loves them enough to plant them." I finished my coffee, set the mug down, and went inside to rummage through the box labeled Misc. That was still half unpacked in the hallway. Somewhere in there, under a tangle of kitchen towels and recipe cards, I found what I was looking for. A handful of seed packets she pressed into my hand the last time I saw her. "Take a little of my garden with you," she'd said. "Start your own. That way, I'll always know where to find you." The packets were old-fashioned, the kind with watercolor drawings of the flowers on the front, zinnias, marigolds, cosmos. The corners were a little worn. The ink on the back had smudged where her thumb had held them. Turned one over and read the instructions, even though I already knew how to plant them. "Old habits. Full sun," it said. "Sow after danger of frost has passed. Cover lightly. Water gently." I stepped back out onto the porch, seed packets in hand, and walked to the bare strip of earth by the sidewalk. Cars rolled by now and then, but the street was mostly quiet. A dog barked a few houses down. Somewhere, a radio played faintly through an open window. Kneeling in that hard soil, I felt a strange mix of nerves and hope. It wasn't about whether the seeds would sprout, that part I trusted. It was about everything the garden represented. A life started from scratch, a marriage that would need tending, a home that needed warmth. I jabbed the trowel into the dirt. It resisted at first, then gave way. I worked in small sections, loosening the soil, pulling out weeds, making room. My knees got damp, and dirt smudged my cheeks as I unconsciously wiped sweat away with the back of my hand. One by one, I pressed the seeds into the ground. Not in perfect straight lines, because life rarely cooperates with those, but in a loose, hopeful curve along the fence line. Zinnias here, marigolds there, a little wild patch of cosmos at the corner where the sidewalk met the driveway. As I covered them with soil, I whispered the way my grandmother used to. "Grow well," I murmured. "Going to make this place beautiful." When I finished, I stood up slowly, my back protesting, and surveyed my work. To anyone passing by, it probably looked like I'd done nothing at all. The yard was still mostly bare, just a few narrow, darker strips of earth where I'd disturbed the surface. No color, no fragrance, just promise. But in my heart, something had shifted. The house didn't feel quite so empty. The yard didn't seem quite so forgone. There was life here now, even if it was still hidden. That evening, when George came home, I met him at the door with dirt on my jeans and a smile on my face. "What have you been up to?" he asked, setting his lunch pail down and kissing my forehead. "I planted a little something out front," I said. "You won't see much yet, but just wait." He pulled back the curtain and peered out at the yard. "Looks like dirt to me," he joked. I swatted his arm lightly. "Give it a few weeks," I said. "You'll see." His lengthened. The air warmed. The world turned that shade of green that only comes in spring, when everything is waking up at once and trying to remember how to be alive. Every morning, I'd stand at the window with my coffee and scan the yard for signs of change. At first, there was nothing. Then one day, I saw it, a tiny, hopeful speck of green pushing through the brown. I went outside and knelt down, peering at the seedling like it was a newborn baby. "Hello, you," I whispered. "Welcome." More followed. Soon the bare strips were dotted with small leaves, then stems. Then one morning, when I pulled back the curtain, the first flower had opened, a bright, unapologetic marigold, standing on its thin stem like it owned the whole yard. I called George over. "See," I said, pointing. "I told you." He looked from the flower to me, his face softening. "You were right," he said. "It's beautiful." As the weeks went by, our little front strip transformed. Zinnias in hot pink and orange, marigolds like drops of sunshine, cosmos with their delicate petals bobbing in the breeze. Bees found their way to us, butterflies too. People walking their dogs slowed down. Some smiled. A few even waved. One afternoon, as I was deadheading the spent blooms, a woman I'd seen but never met stopped on the sidewalk. "Excuse me," she said, a little shyly. "I just wanted to tell you your flowers make my walk to the bus stop so much nicer." I straightened, brushing dirt from my knees. "Thank you," I said, genuinely surprised and pleased. "They're nothing fancy, just some seeds my grandmother gave me." "Nothing fancy," she scoffed gently. "Around here, this is practically a miracle. Most yards are nothing but grass and crabgrass." She glanced up and down the street, then back at me. "I'm Mary," she added, offering a small wave. "Helen," I replied. Nice to finally put a name to a face. From that day on, we talked whenever she passed by. Sometimes just a hello. Times, little snippets of our lives, her long hours at the diner, my hopes for a baby, our shared complaints about the price of eggs. As summer deepened, neighbors I hadn't met started appearing at my fence. "What are those tall pink ones called?" a man from 3 houses down asked one Saturday. "Zinnias," I said. "They're tougher than they look." "Do they come back?" he wondered. "These don't," I said. "They're annuals. But they make enough seeds to fill this whole block if you let them." He nodded thoughtfully. "Might try some next year," he said. "Here," I replied, reaching for a spent flower head. "You don't have to wait that long." I showed him how to break it open, revealing the slender seeds inside, and poured a few into his palm. "Plant these," I said, "full sun. They're not picky." His face lit up. "Thank you," he said. "My wife loves flowers. This might earn me some points." We laughed. It became a habit, sharing like that. A neighbor admired something, I collected seeds or cut a few stems. I'd walk up the block with a handful of zinnias wrapped in damp paper towel, knock on a door, and say, "These were too pretty not to share." The garden grew, but so did something else, a quiet web of connection tying our little street together. When our first child, my son David, was born, the garden was in full bloom. I remember standing on the porch, swaying with him in my arms, the scent of marigolds and earth rising around us, thinking, this is what it means to put down roots. Life, being life, didn't stay picture perfect. There were years when the garden got away from me, when colic and late shifts and money worries meant the weeds grew taller than I intended. There were seasons when drought turned my zinnias into scraggly survivors, and I watched the hose like it was a luxury I might not be able to afford. And then, one year, there was the worst drought of all, the year I lost George. I won't go into all the details. They still sit in my chest like stones. Suffice it to say that one day I had a husband grumbling about my overgrown cosmos. And then, far sooner than made any sense, I didn't. The first spring after he died, I almost didn't plant. I stood in the front yard with the seed packets in my hands, fingers numb despite the warmth of the morning sun. The earth looked harder than it ever had. Every memory of us laughing over crooked rows or arguing about whether we could spare money for more mulch pressed in on me. What's the point? A bitter voice in my head asked. Who are you doing this for now? For a while, I listened to that voice. The packets sat on the kitchen table. The days passed. The dirt stayed bare. Then, one afternoon, Mary knocked on my door. I brought you something, she said when I opened it. In her hands, she held a small tray of seedlings, zinnias and marigolds, from the look of them. My zinnias and marigolds, their grandchildren, so to speak. I saved the seeds from your flowers last year, she said. I thought, maybe you wouldn't feel up to planting. But your garden means a lot to all of us. And if I'm honest, it means a lot to me. It kept me company on some hard mornings, so I started these for you, my eyes filled with tears. Oh, Mary, I whispered. We'll help, she added quickly, as if to head off my protest. Me, the kids down the block, anyone you'll let. You don't have to do it alone this year. I looked past her at the yard, at the bare strip of earth that had once exploded with color. I thought about the way neighbors had slowed their cars to look, the way children had pointed from strollers, the way George used to shake his head at the chaos of it, and then secretly brag about it to his coworkers. I don't know if I can make it look like it used to, I said. She squeezed my arm. Maybe it doesn't have to look exactly the same, she replied. Maybe it just has to be here. Next day, true to her word, she came back with her teenage son, 2 little kids from the corner house, and a man I recognized from further down the street who introduced himself as Tom. We're here to plant, he said simply. We knelt together in the dirt, my heart raw and tender them, bringing laughter and energy and stories about work and school. We tucked seedlings into the soil. We scattered seeds in the gaps. We watered gently, the hose passing from hand to hand. One point, I sat back on my heels, my hands muddy, and watched them. My garden, the one I thought had been mine and mine alone, was now clearly something else, a shared project, a thread weaving our small lives together. In that moment, I understood something my grandmother had known all along. A garden is never just yours, not if you plant it where others can see. That summer, the flowers bloomed again. They looked a little different, more variety, more colors I hadn't chosen. The edges were wilder, the shapes less formal, but the bees still came. The butterflies still danced. Kids still slowed to touch the petals, and people kept stopping at my fence, not just to admire, but to lean their weight on the wood and talk about their days, about their losses, about their hopes. I started keeping a small tin bucket by the front door. Inside, I placed scissors and a stack of old mason jars. If someone mentioned a birthday, I'd say, hold on, disappear inside, and come back with a jar of water. Then I'd step into the garden and cut a bouquet just for them. Flowers are meant to be given away, I'd say, pressing the jar into their hands. Otherwise, they're just showing off. Years went by. David grew up. My daughter Anna came along a few years after him. Played in that yard, their small feet flattening the grass between the beds, their hands as dirty as mine by the end of most summer evenings. Watch the stems, I'd warn as they ran through, laughing. The flowers were here first. They'd de-roll their eyes, but they learned. Before long, they were the ones reminding their friends, stay on the path. Grandma will be mad if you trample the marigolds. We picked tomatoes warm from the sun and ate them right there, juice running down our chins. We watched monarch butterflies lay eggs on the milkweed I'd tucked into a corner. We rescued earthworms stranded on the sidewalk after heavy rain. The garden wasn't just a place, it was a language we shared. When Anna was 8 and came home with tears in her eyes because a friend had been unkind, I didn't give her a lecture. I handed her a small trowel. Come help me, deadhead, I said. We knelt side by side, clipping away spent blooms. Sometimes, I told her, you have to let go of what's done so there's room for new flowers. People aren't always kind, but you get to decide what you plant in yourself. She nodded, taking it in, the way children do when their hands are busy and their hearts are open. We didn't know then that one day, her children, my grandchildren, would stand in those same beds, their own hands in the soil, still benefiting from seeds planted long before they were born. At the time, we were just living, just tending, just sharing. I had no word for legacy. I just knew that every time I pressed a seed into the ground, I was choosing life over emptiness, color over gray, connection over isolation. And I had no idea how far those choices would reach. If you ask my grandchildren what they remember most about my house, they don't usually start with the furniture or the smell of something baking. They talk about the garden, talk about the way the zinnias seemed to wave at them when they tumbled out of the car, the way the marigolds lined the walk like tiny suns, the way the tomato vines turned their fingers green when we picked them on hot afternoons. They talk about how, at Grandma's, you weren't allowed to wear your good shoes outside because the garden comes first, and the garden is muddy. By the time my first grandchild, Lily, was born, the front yard had been blooming for decades. Beds were deeper then, stretching further up the lawn. The original narrow strip had multiplied into a patchwork of color. A bird bath now stood near the center, cracked a little around the edges, but still beloved by sparrows. A curved path of stepping stones, installed the year Anna broke her wrist, tripping over my old straight path, wound from the sidewalk to the front steps. The neighbors, old and new, had gotten used to the idea that Helen on the corner meant flowers. I'd seen kids grow up, move away, and come back with children of their own just to say, I wanted my kids to see the marigolds I told them about. The first day Lily came to visit on her own 2 feet, not in a carrier. She toddled straight to the nearest flower bed, as if drawn by a magnet. Gentle hands, I called from the porch. We touch with gentle hands. She stopped, looked back at me, then lowered herself into a crouch, her little fingers hovering over a bright pink zinnia. Soft, she said, her voice full of wonder. Yes, I said, coming down the steps slowly. Soft and alive. I knelt beside her, my knees creaking in protest, and guided her hand. Like this, I said, brushing the petals with the back of my finger. We don't grab, we don't yank, we say thank you. She nodded solemnly, as if I'd shared a great secret. Tank oo, she whispered to the flower. I smiled. That's how it starts, I thought. One touch, one tiny thank you. From that moment, Lily was my shadow in the garden. Every visit, she'd scramble out of the car before her parents could even unbuckle their seatbelts and shout, Grandma, can we go see the flowers? I learned to greet her with a sun hat and a little plastic trowel waiting on the porch. We planted together, her small hands clumsy at first, then surer. We watered together, though more water seemed to end up on her shoes than the soil those early years. We sang to the seedlings because my grandmother had sung to hers, and some traditions are too good to let slip away. As the years passed, more grandchildren arrived. Ethan, who tried to dig to china in my vegetable bed. Sophie, who cried when we pulled up carrots because they were hiding and we betrayed them. Ben, who memorized the names of every flower and corrected his teacher when she misidentified a cosmos in a storybook. They each had their own relationship with the garden. For some, it was a playground, an endless source of bugs and dirt and hiding spots. For others, it was a classroom where they learned about how bees carry pollen, how worms enrich the soil, how you can't rush a tomato no matter how many times you check it. But under all of that, something deeper was growing. They were learning how to be patient, how to nurture, how to pay attention to small things. On the surface, intergenerational gardening looks like dirt and seeds and little hands in big gloves. But underneath, it's a quiet, powerful kind of teaching, older hearts passing down not just skills, but ways of seeing the world. One summer, when Lily was about 10, I caught her talking to the marigolds. I was on the porch, pretending to read, but really listening to the sounds of the yard, the hum of insects, the distant bark of a dog, the soft murmur of her voice. Grandma says you help keep the bad bugs away, she was saying. It's a big job. Thank you for doing it." He patted the soil gently around their stems, the way I had shown her. It struck me then, these children weren't just learning how to garden. They were learning how to say thank you to the world, not in big, dramatic gestures, in small, steady ones. When they came over on weekends, the first part of the day always belonged to the garden. "Shoes off," I'd say at the door. "Garden shoes on." We'd line up the muddy sneakers and boots on the porch and slip into our well-worn garden shoes, old tennis shoes for them, rubber clogs for me. We'd grab our tools, our hats, our sunscreen. Then we'd step outside and take a moment, just a moment, to look. "What's changed since last time?" I'd ask. At first, they'd shrug. "I dunno," Ethan would say. "It's green. Look closer," I'd urge. And they would. "Oh, the yellow ones are taller. The tomatoes turned red. That flower wasn't open before. Did it wake up?" We'd move through the beds slowly, taking stock. In time, they began to notice things I didn't. "There's a new kind of bug on this leaf. This plant looks droopy. Did we forget to water it? Why is this corner getting more shade now?" They were learning to observe, to connect cause and effect, to care. Those mornings in the garden became our storytelling time too. As we weeded or planted, I'd tell them about my grandmother's garden, about how she used to grow roses so fragrant you could smell them halfway down the street. I'd tell them about the year the rabbits raided my lettuce, and I sat on the porch railing, arms crossed, having a stern conversation with a rabbit that blinked at me like I was the crazy one. They'd laugh, hands busy, hearts open. "Did Mom help here when she was little?" Lily asked once, wiping sweat from her forehead with a dirt-streaked arm. "Oh yes," I said, smiling at the memory. "Your mother used to complain that I made her pull more weeds than her brother. She said it was unfair labor practices." "What's that?" Ethan asked, frowning. "It means she had to work more than she wanted to," I said. "But don't you dare tell her I said it made her strong." They laughed again, the sound mingling with the rustle of leaves. Sometimes they'd share their own stories about school, about friends, about things that were bothering them, but felt too big to say in a quiet living room. There's something about kneeling side by side in the dirt that makes truth come easier. One afternoon, when Sophie was about 12, she pulled up a weed with more force than necessary and blurted out, "Everyone at school thinks I'm weird." I paused, set my trowel down, and waited. The garden teaches you not to jump in too fast. "Why do they think that?" Asked after a moment. "Because I like plants more than people," she said. "Because I'd rather sit under a tree and draw than go to the mall. Because I know all the Latin names and they think that S creepy smart." She said the last words like they tasted bad. I pulled a small clump of grass and tossed it into the bucket. "Well," I said, "plants don't lie. They don't gossip. They don't care what you're wearing. They just respond to how you treat them. That makes you weird. Then I suppose the garden is full of weirdos." She snorted, a surprised laugh escaping. "You know what else?" I added. "Every skill you learn out here, paying attention, being patient, trying again when something doesn't work, those are the same skills that make you good at anything you decide to do. The world doesn't know it yet, but it needs kids who are creepy smart about living things." Her shoulders relaxed a little. "Thanks, Grandma," she said. "You always make it sound okay." "Is okay," I said. "You are okay. Now hand me that bucket. The real weirdos around here are these dandelions." She grinned and passed it over. Intergenerational gardening doesn't just grow plants, it grows confidence, empathy, and a sense of belonging. Years went by. The children grew taller. My knees grew stiffer. The garden adapted, as all good gardens do. We raised some of the beds to make it easier for me to reach. The grandkids helped haul bags of soil and built simple wooden frames. "You're strong," I told them as they lugged the bags. "Stronger than you know now. Remember that." One year, Lily, by then in high school, asked if she could plant a small section her way. "What's your way?" I asked, curious. "I want to mix flowers and vegetables and herbs all together," she said. "Not in separate rows. More like a tapestry." I thought of how my grandmother's garden had been organized in neat, traditional beds. I thought of how I'd started that first strip as a rough curve instead of straight lines. "Show me," I said. She designed a chaos of beauty: tall sunflowers, basil, cherry tomatoes, calendula, and nasturtiums, all tangled together. Pollinators flocked to it. The harvest was generous. The scent of basil and tomato vines and flowers filled that corner like a living perfume. "That's your grandmother's garden in you," I told her one evening as we stood looking at it. Different shape, same heart. She slipped her arm through mine. "Maybe one day I'll have my own yard," she said, "but I want to take pieces of this with me." "You will," I said, "more than you know." I had started all those years ago, planting flowers for neighbors to brighten their walk, to make our street feel more alive. I hadn't realized I was also planting habits and memories that would take root in my grandchildren. They learned, almost without noticing, that you share what grows easily for you. You check on things and people after a storm. You celebrate the first blossom and say thank you for the last. You save seeds because good things are meant to continue. We had a ritual every fall. On the first crisp day, when the air smelled like apples and the school bus schedule had settled into a rhythm again, we'd gather in the garden with envelopes and a marker. "Seed day," Ben would shout. Let some of the best flowers go completely to seed: zinnias with the richest colors, marigolds that had bloomed the longest. We'd gently pull off the dried heads, crumble them between our fingers, and shake the seeds into envelopes. On each envelope, we'd write, "Zinnia's grandma's front bed, 20 marigolds by the mailbox, 20 tomatoes sweetest ones, 20. Sometimes we'd add little notes. From the plant that survived the heat wave, the flowers the neighbor loved, ones the bees liked best. We stored the envelopes in a shoebox in my hall closet. "Why do we save so many?" Ethan asked once. "We don't have enough room for all these next year." "Because gardens are meant to move," I said, "to travel. Some of these will be for us, some will be for neighbors, and some are for places we haven't even seen yet." He frowned, trying to picture it. "Like other yards?" he asked. "Other yards," I said. "Other towns, other lives." I didn't know then how true that would become. I thought those seeds might travel to a few nearby flower pots, maybe a community garden plot, if we ever signed up for one. I didn't imagine they would be tucked into the pockets and moving boxes of my grandchildren when they went off to college, or slid into envelopes mailed across the country with little notes that said, "Plant these and think of us." But that's getting ahead of the story. For the moment, in those years when my hair was fully gray, but my hands were still steady, the garden was our common ground. Even when the grandchildren became teenagers and their lives filled with activities and friends and glowing screens, they still made time, at least once in a while, to come back and help with the garden. Sometimes they'd grumble. "Do we have to weed? Can't we just hang out inside?" 15 minutes, I'd bargain. 15 minutes with your hands in the dirt, then you can escape to whatever digital kingdom you like. Almost every time, 15 minutes turned into 30, into an hour. Because once you start pulling weeds or tying up drooping stems, once you start talking while your hands are busy, time moves differently. They told me about exams and crushes and disappointments, about teachers they loved and those they didn't, about dreams that felt too fragile to say out loud in a more formal setting. "I think I want to study environmental science," Lily confessed one afternoon, twisting a leaf between her fingers. "But everyone says there's no money in that." "Is money the only measure?" I asked. "No," she said, "but it's what people talk about." "Well," I said, "if you follow what makes you feel most alive, you're less likely to wake up one day feeling like you wasted your one chance. Gardens don't grow well if they're planted in the wrong climate. Neither do people." She looked at me, something settling in her eyes. "Will you be mad if I don't become a doctor or a lawyer or something fancy?" she asked. I laughed. "I'll be annoyed if you become anything that drains the light out of you," I said. "But if you choose something that makes you want to get up in the morning, even when it's hard, I'll be proud, no matter what the job title is." She smiled, relief softening her features. "Then maybe I'll plant more than flowers," she said. "You already are," I replied. I didn't always know the right words to say in those moments, but the garden helped. It gave us metaphors to lean on. It gave us a shared language for growth and struggle and resilience. As the grandkids grew into young adults, they started bringing their friends and eventually their partners to meet the garden, along with meeting me. One summer, Lily showed up with a young man named Marco. "He's heard about your tomatoes for years," she said, rolling her eyes affectionately. I figured it was time to see if they live up to the hype. Marco stepped into the yard, looking around with wide eyes. "This is like something out of a storybook," he said. "It's out of a lot of stories," I replied. "We've lived them here." We walked among the beds. "Lily helped plant this section when she was about your age," I told him, pointing to the tapestry bed of herbs and flowers. "She thought I was too boring with my neat rows." He laughed. "Sounds right," he said. I watched him help her pick basil and cherry tomatoes, the way he listened when she explained which plants needed more shade. I watched the way she lit up, sharing something that had shaped her. This garden is working on him too, I thought, amused. That's the thing about a place like this. It doesn't just belong to the person whose name is on the deed. It belongs to everyone who has knelt in it. Everyone who has carried away a jar of flowers or a handful of seeds. Everyone whose story has intersected with it, even briefly. I was getting older. That was no secret to anyone. There were days when my hands ached too much to prune every stray branch. Days when I chose to sit on the bench and watch instead of kneel and dig. Days when I had to ask for help with tasks I used to do without thinking. But the garden didn't scare me the way other parts of aging did, because I could see, with my own eyes, that it no longer depended solely on me. There were neighbors who watered when I was under the weather. Grandchildren who came by, even unasked, to cut back the spent blooms or stake up sagging stems. Friends of my grandchildren who sent me photos of the zinnias they grew on their dorm balconies, saying, "Look, Grandma Helen, your flowers made it to campus." One late summer afternoon, as the light slanted low and turned everything honey gold, I sat on my bench at the edge of the garden, a blanket over my lap. Neighborhood was quieter than it had been in the early years. Some houses had changed hands. Some families had moved away. The maple tree at the corner had grown tall and generous. Lily arrived with her own daughter, a toddler with dark curls and curious eyes. "Come say hi to great-grandma," Lily said, lifting her out of the car seat. The little one, my great-granddaughter, wiggled down, and just like her mother had done years ago, wandered straight to the nearest flower bed. "Gentle hands," Lily said automatically. I chuckled. "You sound like me," I said. "Apple tree," she replied, smiling. We watched as the child reached out, fingers brushing a marigold. "Soft," she murmured. "Yes," I whispered. "Soft and alive." 3 generations stood in that yard, one who had started the garden, one who had grown up in it, and one who was just beginning to learn its language. In that moment, the word legacy finally made sense to me. It wasn't about a big speech or a plaque or my name on anything. It was about this, a little girl learning to be gentle with something living because her mother had learned it here, because I had learned it from my grandmother, because someone, long before Instagram and garden magazines, had decided to plant flowers by fence where other people could see them. Planted flowers for neighbors. Her grandkids harvest the joy today. It sounds like a slogan, a tidy line for a greeting card. Standing there, the late sun on my face, the murmur of bees in the air, my great-granddaughter's delighted gasp as a butterfly landed nearby. It felt less like a slogan and more like simple truth. I hadn't known, all those years ago, that the flowers I planted for strangers walking to the bus stop would become the backdrop for my grandchildren's childhoods. That the tomatoes I tucked into neighbors' hands would teach my grandkids about sharing. That the seeds we saved in old envelopes would travel with them into futures I couldn't quite imagine. I just knew that it felt right to make something beautiful and useful in the place where I'd been planted. The rest unfolded on its own, like petals opening one by one. I always knew the garden would outlive me. Plants teach you that early on. You watch a flower bloom gloriously, then fade, then crumble into seeds that carry its colors into a future it will never see. You don't have to be a philosopher to understand what that means for people too. Still, knowing something in your head and feeling it in your bones are two different things. The year my doctor finally used the word limitations in that careful way doctors do, the garden and I had already made a sort of truce with time. "You'll need to slow down," he said gently. "Pace yourself. Ask for help." I nodded, thinking, he's a bit late to that party. My knees had been sending me the same message for years. My back held a long list of complaints. My hands, though still capable, sometimes refused to close all the way around a trowel by the end of the day. So I did what gardeners do when conditions change. I adjusted. We pulled a few beds in closer to the house to shorten the distance I had to walk with heavy watering cans. We replaced some thirsty annuals with hardy perennials that could fend for themselves better. Grandkids grown now, with jobs and lives and calendars full of adult responsibilities, took turns stopping by to help with what I couldn't do as easily anymore. "Tell us what needs doing, Grandma," they'd say, rolling up their sleeves. "Start with what bothers the plants most," I'd reply. "They're the real bosses around here." It's funny, when you're a young mother or a busy working woman, you always feel like you're racing time. There's never enough of it. Those later years, in the garden, time felt different. Slower, yes, but also richer. I found myself spending more moments just looking, sitting on the bench with a cup of tea, watching the way the light moved across the zinnias as the day went on, noticing which bees preferred which flowers, listening to the way the neighborhood had softened over the decades, from clanging screen doors and loud car radios to quieter electric cars, and the occasional distant song from someone's Bluetooth speaker. Grandchildren dropped by as schedules allowed. Lily, now in her 30s, working in urban planning with a focus on green spaces. "Gee, I wonder where that interest came from," I'd tease. Ethan, who'd gone into teaching, bringing his students to visit once on a field trip so they could see what a living science lesson looks like. Sophie, doing design work, taking photos of the garden at different times of day for a project on spaces that hold memory. And working remotely some days from my kitchen table, laptop open, pausing to refill the bird bath between emails. They still argued over who had to pull the worst weeds. Some things don't change. One spring, when the daffodils by the maple tree were just starting to open, Lily came to visit with Lily's little girl again, my great-granddaughter Emma, a few years older now. Emma ran straight to the garden, as always. "Great-grandma, look," she cried, pointing at a patch of crocuses. "So many colors." I walked out more slowly, cane tapping the familiar path, and stood beside her. "Those crocuses came from your mom's hands," I told her. "She planted them when she was about your age." Emma's eyes widened. "Mommy did?" she asked. "That's right," I said, "and I planted the bulbs that made the ones she planted possible. And my grandmother planted the ones that made mine possible in a different garden a long time ago." Emma thought about that, her brow furrowing. "So, it's like a line?" she asked. "From you to Mom to me." "Exactly," I said. "A line made of petals and roots." She smiled, clearly charmed by the idea. "Then I want to plant one too," she declared. "So there's a flower that starts with me." I felt my throat tight. "We can do that," I said. "We absolutely can." We spent that afternoon planning Emma's corner, a small space by the front steps where she could pick what to plant. She chose, of course, the brightest possible flowers from the seed packets I laid out. "Those," she said, stabbing her finger at a packet of mixed zinnias. "The ones that look like fireworks." "Good choice," I said. "Zinnias are old friends around here." We planted them together, my hands guiding hers the way I had once guided her mother S. We watered them. We marked the spot with a little wooden sign that read, in slightly wobbly pen, Emma's flowers. As the weeks passed, she'd ask her mother to send me photos. "Show great-grandma how big they got," she'd say. On days when I felt tired or achy or small in the face of my own mortality, those photos did something no medicine could quite manage. They reminded me that my story was not ending, it was branching. Grandparents are often told that their greatest legacy is the love they leave behind, the stories they tell, the time they spend simply being present. That's true. Sometimes, if we're lucky, that legacy also has roots and leaves and petals that outlast our physical presence in very literal ways. The year my health took a sharper turn, the garden was in one of its best seasons. We had a gentle winter and a perfectly timed spring. The rains came when they were needed. The heat never grew cruel. Everything seemed to flourish a little extra, as if the garden itself knew it was time to put on a show. Neighbors stopped by more often that summer. Some came to chat. Some brought casseroles and offers of help. Some, newer faces, came with stories of what the garden had meant to them, even before they ever met me. I used to walk past here on my way to night shifts. One young nurse told me, her hand resting subconsciously on her belly, heavy with her first child. "Your flowers made those shifts feel less lonely." I'd always look to see what was blooming. It helped. Another neighbor said, "My mom and I didn't talk much growing up. When we walked the dog past your house, we'd always comment on the garden. It was the one thing we both loved. It gave us something safe to share." I listened to these stories sitting on my bench, a blanket over my knees, and thought, you never really know what you're growing. Not just in the soil, in other people, in yourself. My grandchildren, ever practical, started to ask me questions I hadn't let myself dwell on out loud. "What do you want us to do with the garden later?" Lee asked one evening as we watched the sun go down behind the maple tree. "Keep it," I said automatically. "If you can. And if we can't," she asked gently. I took a slow breath. "If you can't keep it all, keep pieces," I said. "Plants can move. Seeds can travel. Take what you can to your own homes. Share with the neighbors. Let as much of it live on as you're able, in whatever form makes sense." She nodded, eyes shining. "Will you be mad if someone turns it back into just grass one day?" she asked. I thought about that longer than she probably expected. "No," I said finally. "Sad, maybe, but not mad. I did what I was supposed to do while I was here. If someone else doesn't see the value, that's their story, not mine. But I have a feeling," I added, looking at her, "that between you, your brothers, your sister, and this neighborhood, there will always be a little piece of this garden alive somewhere." She reached over and squeezed my hand. "We'll make sure of it," she said. My time came, and it comes for all of us. I slipped away much the same way a garden does in winter. Not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of small surrenders. More naps, fewer tasks, more watching, less doing. I don't remember every detail of those last days with perfect clarity, but my grandchildren do. And they tell the story better than I ever could. They tell of how they gathered in the garden the day after my funeral, at Lily's insistence. She would have hated us sitting in a dark room all day, Lily said. She'd want us out here, where things are still growing. They came with their spouses, their children, their grief. The yard was full of people, of flowers, of stories. Someone brought a speaker and played my favorite old songs at low volume. Children ran up and down the path, occasionally reminded to watch the stems. Out of pure muscle memory. At some point, someone, no one remembers who started it, brought out the shoebox from the hall closet. The one with the envelopes of seeds. They sat at the picnic table, the same one I'd used for potting soil and picnic lunches, and spread out the envelopes. "Look at this," Ben said, holding up one with my handwriting. "Zinnia's grandma's front bed, 2015, from the plant that survived the heat wave." Sophie picked up another. "Marigolds by the mailbox, 2018. The ones the bees liked best." They passed the envelopes around like sacred texts, tracing the ink with their fingers. "Grandma left us instructions," Ethan said quietly. "Not written like a will, written like a continuation. They decided right then and there that they wouldn't let the garden disappear all at once. Instead, they made a plan. Lily and her husband would take cuttings and root divisions of as many perennials as they could, hostas, daylilies, coneflowers, to replant in their small backyard, turning it into a pocket version of my garden. Sophie would collect seeds and document them, using her design skills to create a little booklet of Grandma's garden plants with photos and notes, so future generations would know what they were planting. Ethan would talk to the city about whether a small piece of public land, the strip near the community center, could be turned into a neighborhood garden using some of my saved seeds and divisions. Ben, ever the practical one, would coordinate with the neighbors. "Who wants a piece of Helen's garden?" he asked, standing at my fence, voice carrying down the street. Hands went up. Voices answered. "I'll take some marigolds. I'd love those purple ones she always had by the driveway. My kids want the butterfly flowers." So they dug. They dug up clumps of plants, careful to leave enough in the ground to keep the original garden alive at least another season or two for the new family who might move in someday. They divided roots, potted them, labeled them. They cradled seeds in envelopes and small jars. They walked up and down the street, knocking on doors, delivering bits of my garden the way ID once delivered jars of flowers. "In memory of Helen," they'd say. These, and think of her. The neighbors, some with tears in their eyes, promised they would. Lily and her family went home with a car full of plants and jars. That weekend, they turned their own modest yard into a new version of my old one. Not identical, she told her children as they planted, but carrying the same heart. They placed a small sign by the front bed that read, "Grandma's garden grows here too." Ethan's school, where he taught science, agreed to let him start a small garden program. Brought in seeds labeled zinnias from my grandmother's yard, and told his students stories about how one person's garden can change a whole street. They planted them in raised beds and watched them grow all spring. Sophie designed a set of seed packets with my handwriting scanned onto them. On the back of each, she included a short line. "These flowers come from Helen's garden. Plant them where you are, share them when they grow." And help the neighbor on the corner, who had once admitted he couldn't keep a cactus alive, plant a small strip of marigolds. "If my grandma could teach us, we can teach you," he said. She believed nobody truly has a black thumb, just a lack of practice. The year after I died, my original front yard still bloomed. Not exactly the same, but close enough that people driving by would have recognized it. The years after that, the shapes began to change. A new family moved in. He had different tastes, different needs. They kept some beds, turned others back into lawn. But because so many of the plants had been shared, my garden was no longer just tied to that one plot of land. It had become, in a quiet, unassuming way, part of the neighborhood's DNA. There were marigolds 2 streets over that traced their lineage back to the ones by my mailbox. There were zinnias in pots on apartment balconies downtown, whose seeds had started in my front yard before being mailed to a niece in another city, and then shared again. There were daylilies in the community center's small garden with a little plaque that read, "From Helen's garden with love." And there were, most importantly to me, children, my great-grandchildren, and eventually theirs who grew up with stories of Grandma Helen's garden, the way I had grown up with stories of my grandmother S. He knew, without ever having met me, that flowers could be planted for the sake of strangers. Vegetables tasted better when shared. Seeds in old envelopes carried both color and memory. A person's influence is not measured only by money or titles, but by how many lives feel a little softer, a little brighter, because they were here. One day, years down the line, a little boy sat at a kitchen table in a house you wouldn't recognize from my lifetime. Held an envelope of seeds in his hand, the paper worn soft with age. On the front, in a looping, slightly shaky script, it said, "Zinnia's Grandma's Front Bed, 2015. "Who wrote this?" he asked his mother. Your great-great-grandmother, she answered. Her name was Helen. She started a garden when she was about my age. It's why we grow flowers the way we do. He traced the letters with his finger. She planted these, he asked. She planted the grandparents of those seeds, his mother said. We've been saving them and sharing them ever since. Every time we plant them, it's like she's here with us, just a little, he smiled. Then I want to plant them, he said, so she can see my yard too. Outside, in yet another new garden, in yet another time, he pressed the seeds into the soil. Grow well, he whispered. You're going to make this place beautiful. Didn't know that those words had been spoken, almost identically, in another season, in another lifetime, by a young woman in a bare yard with a packet of seeds and a hopeful heart. He just knew it felt right. That's what a legacy really is. Not a statue, not a grand building with your name on it, but a series of small actions, planting, sharing, tending, that ripple outward long after you're gone. It's the way your grandchildren talk to plants, because you did. The way your neighbors offer bouquets to each other, because you showed them how. The way your great-grandchildren feel just a little less alone, because a story about you has taken root in the soil of their lives. Planted flowers for neighbors. Her grandkids harvest the joy today. The joy looks like a grandchild who chooses a career making cities greener, a neighbor who starts their first garden because they saw yours from the bus window, child who learns that caring for something small and fragile can make them feel big and strong in the right ways, a community that weathers hard times a bit better because they've practiced caring for a shared space together. If you're listening to this, and you have even the smallest patch of earth, or a balcony, or a few pots on a windowsill, I hope you'll remember this. You don't have to create a perfect garden. You don't have to know the Latin names. You don't even have to be sure you're doing it right. You just have to start. Plant a flower where someone else can see it. Share a cutting. Hand a packet of seeds to a child and show them how to tuck it into the soil. Water a tired plant in a neglected corner of your block. Invite a neighbor to pick tomatoes from your vines. You may never know exactly how far those small acts reach. You may never see the full bloom of the legacy you're planting. But somewhere, someday, a grandchild might stand in a garden and say, my grandma started this, even if all she really started with was one marigold by a leaning mailbox. And that, I can tell you from experience, is more than enough.